So good afternoon and welcome to Art History with the Artist and the Librarian. I'm Sarah Burris. I'm the Community Relations and Marketing Coordinator with the Bay County Public Library. Today's program, I'm going to introduce you to Nazi art theft covering 1933 through 1945. If you have any questions, once again, put them in the chat. You're going to want to make it either all panelists and attendees if you want everyone to see it. I'm going to try and look throughout, but I'll definitely review at the end of the program. The next program is going to be Tuesday, April 13th at 2 p.m. and it's going to cover Frank Lloyd Wright. And the link is in the chat already. And another link is a BCPL Unstacked podcast, which is done by the library. I'm one of the hosts for that. And I'm going to talk more about the book at the end of the program, but that's for an interview with Kristen Harmel. This is such an expansive topic. And I'm really just going to be kind of scratching the surface here. As we delve into looting or plunder, this becomes a much more complex subject. The proper way to acquire art and artifacts is through following provenance to make sure the item for sale is being purchased is indeed the seller's to sell and that it doesn't have any hidden histories. Provenance documentation is a record of all past ownership and also helps establish authenticity. If the item is stolen, that chain in the provenance is broken. And then think of every encyclopedic collection that belongs in a museum. What items were a result of even colonization? So African art, Egyptian art collections, Native American art and artifacts. Many museums are currently now trying to look back into the history of the objects and working on correcting the wrongs of the past plundering. This is repatriation for if the work is going to go back to the country of origin. And what we're going to be more discussing today is restitution. And so restitution is for the work to be returned back to the original and rightful owners or their heirs. We will be specifically looking at art theft resulting from Nazi plunder during 1933 to 1945 within Germany and throughout Europe. More than 650,000 pieces were stolen from their owners, who were often Jewish or they were forced to sell at ridiculously low prices. They still stealing the works, but there was some transaction for them. And since this is such a huge span of history, I'm just going to dabble into a few of the chapters. And that way you can kind of get started on your own research. So you can't talk about Nazi plunder without introducing the monstrous mastermind himself, Adolf Hitler. Hitler at one time fancied himself to be an artist. Prior to World War I, he applied and was rejected twice from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Can you imagine how different history would be if he had been accepted? And this is one of his paintings, just as an example of his artwork. I can't remember which museum it's housed in now, but I think a few of them are actually in the United States of his work. And they're mostly watercolor. So I'm going to really go fast through the history. World War I happened, political and societal upheaval. Hitler becomes Germany's chancellor in January 1933. And as soon as he came to political power, art became part of his new nationalist socialist regime. The Reich Chamber of Culture was established and Joseph Goebbels became head of that. And he was just as terrifying as Hitler was. And first, Hitler and Goebbels began removing artwork from the museums they deemed to be degenerate art. These are pieces that they didn't feel reflected the Nazi Party. Just a small sampling of artists coined as degenerate would include Paul Klee, Max Beckmann, Kurt Schwitters, Pablo Picasso, Piet Mondrian, Otto Diess, and Marc Chagall. So hopefully some of those names you recognize. And I'll be showing a few examples later. But note that the art movements included are Dadaism, Surrealism, Cubism, and Expressionism. So anything that kind of strays from that realistic, more just painting what you see it is more along the lines of what's considered degenerate. Hitler even expressed in one of his speeches in 1935 that it is not the mission of art to wallow in filth for filth's sake. And what he claimed to be degenerate was seen as dangerous, and that modern art with Jewish, communist, or un-German influences could endanger public order. And art then was collected throughout regions of Nazi-occupied Europe, including France, stealing them from their original owners as well as the museums. And since there was such a vast amount of theft happening, it's really challenging to narrow down this history. In 1937, Hitler had an exhibit organized to display degenerate art in Munich of 600 pieces primarily focused on German artists that fit this category of degenerate artist. And this exhibit itself, it traveled as for educational purposes across Germany. And this is a photograph where the center guy is Joseph Goebbels, and you can see a few of the pieces that would have been in this art exhibit. In this one piece from the exhibit by Jean Meisinger on Canoe, which would be French for in canoe, 1913, was first purchased by artist George Monk for the Gallery de Sturm in 1916. And this piece was stolen in 1936, along with several other Cubist pieces in his collection. In 1939, many of the degenerate artworks were then resold, and they went to Switzerland to fund the war effort, which is something that I didn't realize, that part of this whole capturing of art was funding the war in a way. And art's used as currency. And some of the pieces that went to Switzerland for sale then ended up in American and other European museums. And others, like this piece, was never recovered, and it was most likely destroyed. Occasionally you'll hear stories of in the news, like just randomly, where someone will discover Nazi loot that was being hoarded or hidden by a family with Nazi ties and just recently recovered. So we're going to look a little bit at another leading figure in the art looting that took place during World War II, Hermann Goering. And he was a horrible human being. He once stated, "I have no conscience, Hitler is my conscience." So just to kind of get a glimpse at what he was like as a human being, he's the one that started the Gestapo, and he didn't want to look bad, so he just like passed that role on to Himmler. And he was second in command, essentially, from Hitler. He was the Marshal of the Reich. But he loved to be surrounded by really fancy things, including art. And he himself hoarded at least 1,000 items, and it may even be closer to 2,000 items. Much of the art was stolen from France. And this other image is an image of Heron Hall, which was his country retreat where he would do hunting and relax and escape from the war. And a lot of the works were housed in this Heron Hall. And it was located northeast of Berlin. And the link that I've included on the top, if you explore the Smithsonian Institute Archives of American Art, you can actually download a partial inventory of his collection that was retrieved through work with the Monuments Men. So you'll be able to see some of the works that were included in that collection include Toulouse-Lautrec, Van Gogh, Renoir, and so on. So big names. Collecting art for Goering became a bit of an obsession, and works in his collection that would have been considered degenerate, such as this Van Gogh painting of Portrait of Dr. Cachet, originally was stolen from a Jewish art collector, and then he would have traded it for a piece that he liked more. So it would have been more a classical painting. And then the art itself is kind of being used as currency to get more art. There's so many individual galleries that are throughout Europe, and especially in France. So I'm just going to touch on two different families that were affected. Mr. Paul Rosenberg is on the left, and he was a Parisian art gallery owner who had many pieces by expressionist, cubist, and impressionist artists. Rosenberg was close friends with Pablo Picasso, and he had a phenomenal eye, including the Matisse, the Van Gogh, and the Toulouse-Lautrec that are pictured in this slide. So it goes from left to right. He worked with museums as well, which ended up in, I guess, somewhat fortunate that 30 of his Picassos were actually being loaned to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, November of 1939, and was out of the gallery by the time the Nazis had taken hold of France in 1940. And the Gestapo had requested the names of all Jewish gallery owners, including Paul Rosenberg's gallery. His family had fortunately escaped, but the Nazis stole around 400 pieces. And it looks like a lot of the pieces went to the Goering collection based on Goering's inventory list. And Rosenberg's son, Alexandra, he had recovered some of the works after the liberation of Paris in 1944. So the work was it was on a train scheduled to leave with Nazi soldiers, and there was 148 crates of modern art in this train. So I don't know if you can imagine how large art is, and imagining 148 crates of art in one train. It's a lot of pieces, and it would have been more than what was of theirs in this collection of works. And Paul Rosenberg relocated to New York City after the war, spending years tracking down the rest of his work that was stolen from the Nazis before his death in 1959. And there are about 60 pieces still missing. And though this title is not in our library collection, his granddaughter wrote a book. And I just wanted to share the title, My Grandfather's Gallery, A Family Memoir of Art and War by Anne Sinclair. And if this is a title that you'd be interested in, I think we could probably request it through interlibrary loan outside of our library system. And this is another family story, but not all stolen works were considered degenerate art. Hitler had plans to build the Fuhrer Museum, housed in Linz, Austria, and was actively collecting for the Fuhrer Museum. The works for this planned museum collection were once again largely stolen. One family that had a large collection with some pieces that were also included in Goering's list is that of Alphonse and Clarice de Rothschild. The Rothschild family was a wealthy Jewish banking family in Vienna until March 12, 1938, when the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany. And the family's property, as well as 3,500 art treasures, were stolen. The Rothschilds were able to escape. Much of the Rothschilds' collections stolen were classical European decorative arts and paintings. These works eventually made it into the abandoned salt mines of the Alta Sea in Austria to be held safe from bombings towards the end of the war. Allied troops recovered the works in the salt mines in the summer of 1945, but it took years for the family to claim what was theirs. And then, and this is a crazy story, they wanted to relocate to the United States, and Austria forced them to donate 250 of their nicest pieces to Austria for their museums. And this is not the only country that did similar things, but Clarice's daughter, Bettina, continued to fight for ownership. And then Austria's art restitution law wasn't passed until 1999, which then returned the objects taken by the Nazi regime from the Austrian federal institutions back to their original owners or heirs. And part of the Rothschild collection after they received restitution was gifted to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I am just in love with the way they do their website. So you can search the collection, each of their items. If you search Rothschild, it'll pull up all the items that were in this collection. And each piece has its individual history and story. So you find a little bit more information about how it survived the war. And everything's beautiful to look at as well. So I encourage you to explore. So we can't dive into Nazi looting without talking about the monuments men. We were able to recover the works that made it to the salt mines when Allied troops recovered the work in 1945. The members of the Monuments, Fine Art, and Archives section was also known as the Monuments Men, consisted of primarily American and British, who were called to action in 1941 to preserve cultural landmarks, monuments, and fine art. Many of the Monuments Men were curators, conservators, art historians, librarians, and even artists, and their invaluable knowledge was used to help preserve culture for future generations. And this is not in just tracking and locating looted art back to its original owners. It also meant working with the Allied troops who were planning to drop bombs in cities and knowing exactly where murals were located, which churches were located where, as well as like sculptures and public works as well. And they wanted to avoid bombing those areas. Italy, for example, was bombed by Allied troops to gain control in the war. However, it is also a country full of cultural landmarks, sprinkled throughout with invaluable treasures. They would also go to sites to see what could be salvaged if destruction hit. So in this photograph, just to kind of glimpse at what kind of expertise the monuments team had, there's Walker Hancock, who was an American sculptor and sculpture professor. Lamont Moore, who studied art history and was a museum conservator. George Stout was an art conservator at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which we introduced last class, previously working in conservation at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard. And he was really a meticulous cataloger. And so this cataloging skill really comes in handy as well, documenting which pieces are where and if they've relocated, where they're located then. And he helped train a lot of the curators as monuments men throughout most of 1942. And the last person to mention that there is one unidentified monuments man, but the last one is Thomas Carr Howe, who was fluent in French and German. He worked in museums, and in 1933, he was an administrator of Roosevelt's New Deal Works Progress Administration. So that's like all those public works projects with murals, as well as like Dorothea Lange would have been part of that with her farm administration work, all the photos that she's taken. So this is just like a little tiny glimpse. You could probably do a whole program on just like one monuments man. And if you want to find more information, monumentsmenfoundation.org is a place to check out. Now, my favorite monuments man was not a man. It was Rose Valland. She is amazing. And she is French. She's part of the French Resistance. She was a curator at Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris, which is located, it's the location in Paris where all the stolen works that were going through France and Paris stopped at this location and then would get on a train and then head into like Goering's private collection. So she was the one French curator that was able to kind of take care of the Jeu de Paume's permanent collection while the war is taking place. And she spoke German, but the Nazis that were working there did not realize. So what she would do, she had a brilliant memory, and she would listen to where each piece was going, what train it was on, what family it came from. And at home, she would document all of this information so that after the war, things could kind of start getting put back together on which piece was supposed to be where and who the families were that they were stolen from. And her whole life is in danger at this time because since she was the only French curator working at the Jeu de Paume Museum, and the rest were Nazis working specifically on their art looting team. And Goering himself visited this museum personally. It was like his own private gallery, and he would just be like, I want that one, that one, that one. And he would select what he wanted for his personal collection. And then another note, which I didn't realize until after doing this program, was that the French women in France were not allowed to vote until 1944. So it's impressive that she both had she was a spy, and she was a woman that's in a man's world as a curator at a museum. And she started as an unpaid curator, and then she became permanently paid in 1941. And after the war, her work didn't end there. That's when she really was working on trying to relocate the pieces back to their homes, which you can kind of see in this picture on the right from the Smithsonian Archives. So I have a few pictures of post-World War II art recovery. And here's Vermeer's The Astronomer being recovered in an Austrian salt mine, which would have been safeguarded by the Nazis from bombing. So they're trying to protect the work too, because they want it either to go to your museum or be sold, or maybe it was part of their museum collections. And so you can kind of see what it would have looked like. So these are monuments men pulling from the storage that was housed within the salt mines. And the salt mines would have been relatively safe. I mean, long term, I think it probably would damage, but during this time, it kept them underground and away from bombing. This piece originally did belong to Alphonse de Rothschild, which is the family that we mentioned previously. But once it was returned to the family, it was then sold, and it looks like it's now housed at the Louvre. It's a beautiful piece. Here's an image of Dwight Eisenhower examining some of the stolen works, and George Patton in the center. This is located in the Markerns Mind in Germany, and it was discovered by monuments men as well, and packed with everything from Greek and Roman antiquities, Albrecht Dürer, Rubens, Goya, and so forth. And you can tell it's getting towards the end of the war with April 12th, 1945. 1945 is kind of that end. Edward Manet's and the conservatory was housed in the Markerns Mind as well, but it had always been in the National Gallery in Berlin. So it's one of their pieces. I just thought it was so pretty that I wanted to share it anyways. And so bombings were happening throughout Germany, and even Goring's Karen Hall that I showed earlier, that whole entire place was destroyed with bombs, but the artwork had been relocated into a salt mine prior to that 1945. And this image just shows art looted by the Nazis. It was being stored in a church in Ellingen, Germany. And the photograph was taken on April 24th, 1945. It's a lot of art. Okay. I also wanted to highlight the history of portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. I should have looked up the pronunciation, by Austrian painter Gustav Klimt in 1907. Here's a photograph of Adele on the right, and she's a wealthy socialite in Vienna. She had passed away in 1925 from meningitis at the age of 44. And the painting was then her husband Ferdinand's until it was seized by the Nazis in 1938 when the Nazis took over Austria. And then since they were a Jewish family, and then Ferdinand was able to escape. However, he died shortly after the war. So then the piece would have belonged to his brother's family since they had no direct heirs. Austria held the piece in the Austrian National Gallery in Vienna in 1941, and then it just kind of remained there after the war. And this one is the piece that is often referred to, the woman in gold. And he did use gold leaf on his works. Maria Bloch-Altmann, Adele's niece, is a large part of the story. She had been given Adele's earrings and necklace as a wedding gift. I think you can see, I don't know if it's these earrings and necklace, but she was gifted a set of earrings and necklace. And then it was, the jewelry was also seized by the Nazis in 1938. And those in particular ended up with Hermann Goering as a present for his wife, which is crazy. And okay, so the Altmanns fled to America, which was not an easy journey, and they ended up in California. And the painting, through investigation, was one where the Austrian National Gallery was using Adele's will for her husband to donate the piece to the museum after his death. However, his will states that the painting would go to his nieces and nephews because it was written a little bit closer to the war and times had changed since her death. Marie took the Austrian government to court and won the case in 2004. She received the piece 2 years later, and then she knew that her aunt would have wanted the public to see the piece, so she sold it to the new gallery in Manhattan for $135 million. So it's a beautiful piece. So it's a little bit of an overview of some of what happened to the artwork. However, just imagine how many gallery owners, how many individual pieces of art, how many churches, how many synagogues, all the stuff that would have been stolen. This is a huge story to narrow down into whittle it down into a little bite-sized piece. So I want to encourage you to do your own research, and here are a few resources that you can use. My go-to is The Rape of Europa, which is a documentary, and it covers so many aspects of the war, the art heist in World War II, and includes documentary footage, actual footage from the war, and it includes the interview with Maria Bloch-Bauer herself. It's got all the stories that I've kind of touched for the most part in this program. That's the one where I'm like, you have to watch it if you want to learn more. The Rape of Europa. There is a book format of it as well, but I don't know if it's a direct. But this is so much a documentary film. I strongly recommend you watching it. If you're interested in The Monuments Men, I suggest to read The Monuments Men by Robert Edsel. The movie is, I think it's that whole thing of trying to compact all this information into one, like 2.5 hour film. And it's really challenging to do it successfully. So I didn't think the film was done very well. I mean, it's okay, but it wasn't my favorite. I would suggest the book. Kate Blanchett's character in the film is supposed to kind of be a fill-in for Rose Valland, but they took some creative license. They changed her name, but it's supposed to be similar to her. And if you want to learn more about Gustav Klimt's painting, there's The Lady in Gold by Anne Marie O'Connor, or you can watch the film Woman in Gold, and Helen Mirren was phenomenal. She's the one that plays the niece, and it was very well done. So I recommend that as well. All of those are in the library collection. And what I've been reading lately is Goering's Man in Paris, and it's the story of Nazi art plunder in his world. It's a Yale University Press publication. So it is geared for art historians, and it's a little bit more academic. However, I feel like the story is fascinating enough that there's like 100 pages that are just notes in the back. So it's like 300 pages total rather than super thick. And it dives more into Bruno Laus, who the Museum Jeu de Paume, which is the one that Rose Valland worked at. So she is a character in this nonfiction as well. And so he kind of is the lead guy at the Jeu de Paume, and he is working with Goering, and he's kind of figuring out what Goering wants. And Goering meets with him directly. He's kind of a smoozy character. He wasn't an art historian, but he's part of the SS. And he's involved with stealing the modern degenerate works and exchanging them for old masters. He stole many pieces for himself, and Dutch masters were his favorite. And if you want to, this is a great title. So if you want to know kind of what happens after the war, because he has to go through a denazification process. The book even mentions Swiss bank accounts that were found after his death in 2007 that were filled with art. And and they're now being traced back to their owners. So we think that this story is resolved. It's been a long time since World War II, but this is still in progress. Museums are still working out what's where, as well as families trying to find their pieces, and things are just kind of popping up and showing up. It's like, okay, we thought it was destroyed, but it's not. And then the last book is the Kristen Harmel, and that's connected to the podcast link that I put at the top of the chat box. And she does historical fiction. She primarily does set her books in France during World War II. And the Book of Lost Names, Ava flees from Paris to a free zone, and she ends up forging identity documents with her artistic talents to help Jewish children flee to safety to Switzerland. And it was a really fun read. I strongly suggest this one. It was a lot of, I enjoyed it. I devoured it in like a day and a half. So highly recommend. And thank you guys so much for joining me.